Welcome to Brevis Talk. The talks you are about to hear will be honest, revealing, and unfiltered. Join us as your host, Pastor Wayne Whiteside, lifts the lid of silence and has conversations about mental illness and health in the church. The goal here is simple. It is to help someone along this journey of life who is struggling. It is to tell the truth to the unsuspecting. And it is to lighten the load of a fellow traveler. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to serve as medical advice or to replace consultation with your physician or mental health professional. If you are experiencing a medical crisis, call 911 or go to the nearest emergency room. Now, here's your host, Pastor Wayne.
Welcome back to another Brevis Talk. A listener advisory has been given because of the nature of the subject that is being discussed today. Suicide. It is the second most common cause of death in those aged from 15 to 24 years of age. Approximately 45,000 people will commit suicide in these United States. Those younger than 30 are more likely to also have a substance abuse disorder. Firearms will be the means in which most males commit suicide. After the age of 15 to 24 years of age, males over 75 years of age are more prone toward ending their life through suicide. Our veterans are at 7 times greater risk than others. These are very sad and dismal facts, but people can be helped. At a very small part, my experiences with some individuals who took their lives. The first one was my paternal grandfather. There's not enough time or space here to give a detailed account of his life. He was certainly loved by his family. I can say that I dearly loved him. As a young adult, I knew many of the mistakes that he had made in life and some flaws that were present in his life. I had no idea that he harbored thoughts of ending his life, however. And of course, at this time in my life, the subject of suicide, for me, simply limited to my knowing what the word meant. My grandfather was in his 70s when he took his life. Looking back and having thought a great deal about the end of his life, I think it was like many suicides in that the event was a coming together of many things. A friend of mine calls these types of tragedies crap storms. I think this description is probably an apt one. My grandfather, in some ways, had become a bit of an island in his life because of some personal hurts in relationships that he had caused. He tended to be a very nervous type individual, and I think the older he got, the less control he had over his emotions, like being sorrowful, crying, and just dealing with things in general. He was an extremely private person, and no one knew the extent to these emotional challenges, coupled with ongoing health problems that he was having. He was certainly not someone to talk about his difficulties. I suppose that would be true of most who were raised in his generation. I was young, married, and had a small child when I received the news of his death. So much of that time is a blur for the mind and the emotions. It was in December, and our family would gather in a cemetery for a graveside memorial. I knew so little about what had happened. It was a few years later that I would ask questions and began to know more. He was loved, and he is missed. The crap storm here was the coming together of his island-like lifestyle, loss of emotional strength and resilience, and the health challenges that befall us all as we grow older. I have asked myself more than once if he knew how much he was loved, because he was loved. What would things have been like if he had talked to someone? The second person that I knew who would take their life was a young church member who attended the first church that I would pastor. She came from a family of 4. Her mother had lived an extremely stormy life. She had been married numerous times and had many more male suitors than her husbands. She began attending the church with her 2 children. Her son was a simple-minded young man in his early 20s. He was such a sweet and fun person. He saw the best in everything, and he loved to visit with everyone. Her daughter was around 15 or 16 years of age. She was extremely reserved and quiet. All of the members of this family were deeply troubled people that life had not been kind to. The mother had numerous and complicated problems, most of them seeming to be self-inflicted. The son was so joyful until he wasn't, and then he would erupt in a violent and terrible fit of rage, only to settle down afterwards and cry until he was exhausted from crying. We knew less about the daughter. One thing that was obvious was her dress. In the hottest weather, she was always wrapped up in heavy clothing. Little by little, her mother unraveled some of her story. The daughter had been repeatedly raped by a stepdad. He was currently incarcerated because of his crimes against her. The daughter was also a cutter, or someone who self-cut themselves. They did not attend church for a long duration. They moved from the area. The young daughter was placed in a foster home, and from time to time I would hear about how well she was doing. She had gone to college and had a career. Then several years later, I would receive the news that she had spiraled into a dark depression and ended her life. I have thought much about her and how life seemed to be stacked against her at an early age. The third person that I knew who took their life was an elderly man who lived not too far from a church that I pastored. He was such a kind man. We had many conversations when we would cross paths with one another. I will never forget the day that he took his life. I drove by his home one morning. He was in his yard raking leaves. He saw me and gave a hearty wave as I drove by. Later, as I came back through our neighborhood, it was covered up with law enforcement patrol cars. I knew everyone in that small area, and so as I slowed to stop in the traffic, I asked an officer what was going on. He told me the terrible story of my neighbor. None of it made any sense. The way he waved at me was forceful and energetic, certainly not a small wave. He seemed exuberant with his wave. It made no sense. None at all. The story that would come out later told a different story. A few years previous, he had lost a child in an automobile accident. Every year, around the date when he lost his son, he would go into a deep depression. He commented to many during these times about how much he missed his son and wanted to go be with him. I don't know all of the particulars, but I now believe that he made up his mind that he was going to take his life. I believe that the time that I saw him in his yard was before his wife left the house on an errand. To this day, I can still see his last big smile and his waving at me as I drove by. He masked it all so well, not just from me, but from others as well. His family, the community, his many close friends were all stunned. The fourth person who took their life was my son, Tyler. With the Lord's daily grace, I cope and move forward with the loss of Tyler. I was and am still devastated by this loss. He was such a remarkable person and such a bright light in our family. Every day we feel this loss. I've lost my grandparents, my dad, and my brother. All of these losses sting within the heart and soul. However, there is nothing that compares to the loss of a child. The loss of a child that is compounded by suicide is so shocking and brutal that words fail me in describing it. In future episodes, I will talk about my son and the topic of suicide. My precious wife, Sherry, will join me for some of these episodes. Thank you for stopping by. Share the podcast with others, and remember, be kind to others. Always be kind.
And that concludes our broadcast today. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Plus, check us out at our Facebook page or at brevistalk.com and take a look at our blog. And remember, be kind. Always be kind.